For me, the More Than Concrete Blocks series is probably most fruitful and rich in how it sets out to understand lesser known situations, while both an inventory and a drilling down to big ticket local modernism and nation building architectural programmes, More Than Concrete Blocks is, in my view, at its most exciting when it moves the reader through flat block stairwells, roofs of schools, industrial suburbia, or the architectonics of infectious diseases. As you will know by now, the series is designed for the interested non-specialist reader as a mostly first-ditch attempt at changing hearts and minds. And in that, it is about defamiliarising the familiar, setting everyday buildings in rationalising frameworks, intellectualising them, asking why the thing behaves the way it does, what were the original design intentions, the original social need, i.e. function, how were the makers thinking, and so on. If those are my aspirations and motivations for More Than Concrete Blocks, then my choice for today's talk makes good sense. But also in designing this symposium with Charles Duggan so that we might think about maintenance, maintaining late modernist or postmodern or simply more recent buildings through change, through extending use, through countering social obsolescence, in short, late 20th century architecture and the circular economy, then I couldn't have chosen a more apt architecture than Gerry Cahill's work with Focus Ireland at Stanhope Green. Begun in 1988 as a rehabilitation and adaptation of a 1907 convent building, itself an extension to an 1810s manor house, Stanhope Green opened its doors in 1991 as 96 dwellings or housing units, along with a host of communal functions such as a library, a renowned restaurant for residents and public alike, and a homework club. In about 2011, some changes were made. Communal rooms swapped function, the library becoming staff offices, for instance. Meanwhile, the original 96 homes were reduced to 72 due to changing prescriptions around minimum housing standards. And material upgrades to Cahill's late 1980s architecture included UPVC windows, replacing timber ones, and the insertion of a new lift. But the point is that the buildings and the site as a piece of city, indeed a miniature city in itself, has been in more or less constant occupation since the mid-19th century due to thoughtful architectural interventions and a culture of social care. It's a continuum led, most unusually for urban Ireland, by a caring framework, not by a productive growth framework. As well as its endurance, I'm interested in how this project presents another architectural history of Irish postmodernism, one which emanates from marginal lives and marginal accounts. As an architect cum social activist, teacher cum writer, Dubliner, but always citizen of the world, Gerry Cahill first made a public mark in his call to arms, Back to the Street. Published in 1980, is that moved on? Yeah. I can't see now because we've no screen, so I'm kind of speaking in the blind. Anyway, published in 1980 by UCD and Cement Roadstone, this short book was the product of a research fellowship. Polemical, but well researched, it sits in the middle of Volume 3's Architectural History of Dublin, just as Central Bank bombastically opens its office plates, heralding a final cost of £10 million. And just as the first attempt at reinvented artisan dwellings are inhabited by Dublin families, Gerry Cahill's polemic states, so much of Dublin, apart from the very few privileged streets and squares, looks like the bombs have just stopped falling. Redevelopment, where it does occur, merely appears to follow the pattern of other Western cities and produces an ever-growing office and commercial district, structures that the microchip will one day make redundant. These developments rarely follow the ethic of quality, bowing instead to the new dictate of quantity. Political tensions in Northern Ireland were reaching an impasse while the Republic In the Republic, political scandals, government coalitions, social activism and moral fundamentalism were the mainstay in the early to mid-1980s. Referenda on abortion, on divorce, ongoing criminalisation of homosexuality point to a population not ready for too much change. Much about Ireland at this time was still firmly locked up, entrenched in the ways of previous orders. And it wasn't an easy place for architecture. Cahill made a living commuting between Dublin and London, while the 1978-79 fellowship, the Back to the Street project, he examined the neighbourhood of the Liberties, characterised then and now by low-rise, high-density housing, streets of artisan dwelling cottages interrupted by churches, the occasional market building, small warehouses and commercial arteries. The Liberties morphology represented an image of traditional Dublin to the young architect, and yet in front of his eyes that morphology was being bulldozed while its community was being hollowed out. Cahill called for a new inner city renewal agency to be set up, inciting alternative economic models of land distribution and collaboration so as to overcome dereliction. On his journey through the Liberties, Cahill had been introduced to a multidisciplinary group, SCARP, or the South City Area Research Partnership, which was connected to the Combat Poverty Agency. For Cahill, the architect's tools of surveying the site and proposing design solutions could be made more meaningful in the context of the social worker, in the context of the community worker. This would be the way to remediate urban dereliction, incrementally with integrity and taking the lead not from the planner or the commercial developer, but from the social activist. So it was that Gerry Cahill met Sr Stan. Both were at the coalface of social and urban dereliction in 1980s Dublin. Sr Stanislaus Kennedy, Sr Stan as she's known, had just finished a fellowship in UCD in the early 1980s. Examining the nature of homelessness amongst women in Dublin, it led to her setting up Focus Point, later Focus Ireland, in 1985 as an organisation which would help people to move on from homelessness. It began with the leasing of a building in Temple Bar, part information hub, part drop-in centre, part restaurant. By 1986, and in between researching, publishing and lobbying, Sr Stan persuaded her order of nuns, the Sisters of Charity, to give her their old convent building to transform into homes. They were moving to a smaller, new premises on the site. The nuns were. What had been evolving was Stan's philosophy and practicable theory that homelessness was not a state of being, but rather a stage in one's life. That to be homeless should not define a person, that there is no one typical homeless person. And critically, for our story here, that hostels are not appropriate housing solutions for homelessness. Cahill's interest in city was an interest in housing. Sr Stan's interest in people experiencing homelessness was also an interest in housing. I'll give you that back if you don't mind. One less machine to manage. That's still flashing, by the way. Okay, this is the image of the day, I think. When Sr Stan managed to procure the convent building in 1986, she knew the very architect who could help. Her purpose was to make alternative, emergency and long-term housing. And Cahill's knowledge of building fabric and his design pursuit of alternative housing forms and types placed him well, alternative being the key issue. Furthermore, and from the outset, this convent conversion project was about more than accommodation. This was about hope, ambition, rehabilitation, fellowship and dreams. And Cahill not only understood this, but he and his design team, the quantity surveyor and the builders embraced it. Little survived of the original institutional architecture by the time the team came to the site. The 1810s manor house, predating the Sisters of Charity's arrival on the site, was demolished in 1987. At the same time, the nuns' 1860s chapel, designed by George Ashland, was also demolished. What was there on this site, up the hill on Stanhope Street, was a bulky 3-storey polychromatic brick building, which was developed again by Ashland in the early 1900s. A survey was needed, concluding that this main bricky block, full of wet and dry rot, would determine most design decisions. Externally, the symmetrical block with its medley of browns, blues and yellows was resplendent with neo-Gothic features, typical of 19th century British and Irish religious buildings. Steeply pitched roof, marked with decorative crosses, the large statue of Mary presiding over the entrance from her roof-lined pediment, the projecting central bays, the granite dressings, delineating the large windows, were all in good condition and demanded retention. Adding a new stair block to the east end, as well as a ramp to the side of the entrance, Gerry Cahill's moves were quiet, enabling the original facade's continued dominance, with some repointing, repairing of windows, and cleaning of dressings. The close attention paid to the original provided the architects with the logic of the emerging floor plan. Nuns' rooms were to become the basis of single-person homes. Services were to be housed in enlarged corridors. Into the principal stairway was inserted a diminutive lift shaft, while another East End staircase was added over all. Windows and details like skirting or ceiling decoration mostly remained the same. Pacing the public and the private, Cahill pushed the old convent building to contain small dwellings, feeding them from the bright and hard-working corridors. Then stop, interrupt both circulation route and private home with large sitting room, homework club, library and public restaurant. The floor plan was wrought, even overwrought, and was experienced in this way like a rhythm of compression or tightness interspersed with openness. After all, the architecture was quasi-Victorian Catholic institutional architecture. The public rooms at both ground and first floors provided just those open breathing spaces, attempting to bring reprieve from the institution. The next move, problem 2, was to assess where new structures could be placed. From the outset, Cahill was drawn to the convent's siting. At a height and bearing south, it looked over the city. The convent's oblique positioning of the sloping Lower Grange Gorman, together with the arched gateway entrance, brought a sense of drama to the place as a journey. The architects carried this self-conscious journeying through the whole project. Movement and sequence underpinned the unfolding master plan, for that is what it was, a master plan. Sr Stan and the architects wanted to make homes. They wanted to make as many homes as they could without resorting to crowding or ghettoising. As such, the architects interpreted the convent and its curtilage as a campus to be reshaped. Cahill describes his adaptation with a pen in his hand, more or less drawing one precise, albeit sweeping gesture from gateway to green, through and into the convent, around and out the back to a new cloister. I'd love to point here, but I just don't want to leave my script at this point. The architect is here, so you can ask him afterwards to show this drawing. He drew this for me, and it's a very precious thing. He's clear that this journey or promenade is a single one. However, many encounters happened along the way. And through it, the building starts to reveal itself from entrance to courtyard to cloister. From that premise, the new housing was made in 3 forms. Firstly, at the new green, and facing the convent, Cahill designed the terrace of 10 2-storey houses. At only 60 metres squared each, they are so diminutive as to be barely noticeable upon arrival, especially in the shadow of the convent. Front doors puncturing the yellow brick walls with their navy machine brick friezes are invariably open. Children and adults come and go, sit at thresholds, supervising one another. These are long-term homes for families. Secondly, we have the homes within the convent block. And third, the third housing structure, the cloister, is undoubtedly the architectural surprise and climax of Stanhope Green. At the back of the block, and hemmed in by a former laundrette to the east, we find this cloister. Here, a pair of two-storey pitched roof ranges with colonnade elevations at ground level enclose a rectangular courtyard. Hewn from a fairly radical but affordable concrete block, Forticrete. There you are, Bernard, I promised I'd get it in. Choosing a rough textured Forticrete block to complement the back of the convent building with its rough stone walls, the material brought sensory richness to the space. And 1980s Dublin would not be 1980s Dublin without Forticrete. As a reinforced concrete block system, it provided its own structure. It looks different. It feels particular to the cloister, reminding us that we are in another part of the scheme, showing us that each part of Stanhope Green, while unified, could have its own character. This cloister is not a universal place where one size fits all, but as a residential setting, it must work harder than most in bringing a mix of long-term homes and shorter-term step-down dwellings together into a tight space. In this way, the architecture is backdrop, not neutral or passive, but never willful or overbearing. Architectural historian John Ollie critiqued Stanhope Green in 1993, praising its cohesion, its ability to bring privacy and public amenity. Contrasting it to the contemporaneous group project, Making a Modern Street for the Liberties, which John Ollie claimed to be, quote, a jamboree of tricks and contortions, unquote. This project, Stanhope Green, was, he wrote, quiet, quote, quiet and unpretentious, akin to a miniature city with the hierarchy and diversity of accommodation, unquote. This was probably the first time that a convent had been converted into any form of social housing in Ireland. How to go about that? How could it be kept, yet changed, so that it would work socially and financially? Such issues of bottom-line economics and social crisis, coupled with the unprecedented architectural challenge, drove the project on. Sr Stan, crunching numbers and pushing a pioneering social agenda around homeless housing, Cahill and his team soon provided 61 single-person dwellings across 3 floors of the old convent building. Technologically, each unit held waste and water infrastructure, ventilation, and independent electricity. Domestically, this translated as a self-contained kitchen, bathroom, and bedroom sitting room. Existentially, it amounted to a room of one's own, to privacy, to retreat. Cahill speaks of the structural and design decisions in response to the economic and social imperatives to provide as much as possible. The old building had a structural logic running through its 3 floors that he worked with, and then asked, what is the smallest unit that won't make you, the resident, go mad? Seemingly well-being in its late 1980s iteration was the common denominator in this remarkable residential project. Robust, realistic, modest and mild-mannered, Cahill's adaptation of Stanhope Green Convent for Focus Ireland has endured. A lot has transformed with the cloister, the award-winning moment of the scheme. It won the Irish Concrete Award in 1991, since the architects completed the original hard-edged scenography in 1991. Today, this place bristles with biodiversity and human activity. It's a verdant oasis, a secret garden in Dublin's North City. Not only has plant life invaded the concrete spaces, but Cahill's colonnades have been filled in, thereby changing how the 2 blocks touch the ground. While this change from columnar rhythm to wall window articulation is significant, making a more substantial and blocky block than the architect intended, the overall design ethos is not compromised. If anything, such easy transformations speak to the clear yet absorbent geometries, to the strong yet elastic form. and functions informing Cahill's architecture for Focus Ireland here. The whole place today is the setting for a quietly thriving residential community of families, couples, new Irish, elderly people, single people, long-term residents, and those in transition from prison and from homelessness. Albeit providing a lot of support from Focus Ireland staff, Stanhope Green is a microcosm of 2020's Dublin perhaps, and certainly a lesson of what can be done on a tight budget. In conclusion, Stanhope Green came out of the fellowship between a nun and an architect in 1980s Ireland, where Sr Stanislaus Kennedy, the nun, was working with women in homelessness. Gerry Cahill, the architect, was working with the derelict city. Sr Stan's work and writings on social needs, caring and poverty inspired Cahill, introducing him to an alternative caring discourse outside of the Irish family and so-called natural caring units. For Cahill and this younger generation of architects, who we'll hear about more from Merlo next, graduating from UCD architecture into a bleak recession, the city and the home in contemporary Ireland were broken. The radical volunteerism and prophetic activism of Sr Stan challenged the modernist paradigm with its architectural canon, its social apparatus. Through the lens of a reactionary care framework, sparked in part by Irish psychiatric deinstitutionalisation in the 60s and its subsequent housing crisis, or homeless crisis, Sr Stan reconceptualised homelessness as an avoidable stage in any life, plainly critiquing contemporary Irish social and housing policy and making the case for expanded care in 1980s and 1990s Dublin, indeed Ireland. Her activism sought sites on which to build different types of homes, countering that traditional Irish shelters and hostels were not homes. Soon, having established Gerry Cahill Architects in 1984, Cahill was adapting these scarcely redundant religious buildings and carving new housing communities from brownfield sites. After Stanhope Green in 2000, he extended the accommodation and use of the 19th century presentation convent of George's Hill around the corner in Dublin's Markets neighbourhood. Later, he brought about 50 homes to the Mercy Convent on Cork Street for Sophia Housing, an offshoot of Focus. A fan of Jane Jacobs, Niamh Brown and Christopher Alexander, Cahill's training in London with Camden Borough and Levitt Bernstein, indeed even the student-based construction company he and others established to convert a Victorian house into 2 flats, set him up to see through supposed obsolescence, to find value in the undervalued. From the outset, he brought relatively inexpensive materials from crinkly tin to portal frames and more sustainable materials under the noses of his patrons before that was ever a thing. And his claim to fame is that he never worked for a private developer. Indeed, such radical patronage, and this is my last point, you'll be glad to hear, such radical patronage or radicalised bureaucracy of patronage was at play at Stanhope Green, whereby Focus Point had established an approved housing body, Wing, Focus Housing Association, onto which Cahill was co-opted. In this way, the typical separation of client, builder, designer, developer was overcome at Stanhope Green. The architect was part of the fundraising mechanism, and of course, another critical element towards the utopian project's realisation was the new housing legislation, the 1988 Housing Act, which tried to tackle homelessness at its heart and allowed £20,000 per unit created as against £2,000 previously. Along with a new Arts Council of Ireland research project into Gerry Cahill's practice under Michael Hayes and Emer Arthur, we hope that our essay in Volume 3 of More Than Concrete Blocks goes some way in establishing the importance of this building work, this maintenance of buildings through adaptation and reconsideration, this making of new homes from old stock. Thank you.